Okay, so in this unit so far, we've learned some identities, and we've simplified using identities as well as did some trig proofs. So what we're actually going to do now is we're going to look at how do we solve a trig equation, and it might help if you can see. Okay, so when we look about solving a trig function, we're going to go back a couple units, and we're going to need this all students take calculus to help us figure out what quadrants our solutions are going to lie in. Usually we're going to be given a range, so we're going to be looking for all the angles between 0 and 360, which means we're going to end up with 2 answers a lot of the time. But we will run into this scenario where we actually might end up with 4 or even 6 answers depending on the type of problem. And we'll go through those so that you know what those are going to look like and how to handle them. So when we go to solve, we're doing it a lot like we did a couple units ago. We're not doing inverse, we're doing specifically finding all the angles. Inverse and solving are a little bit different, but so that's why we're going back, not what we did with arcsine, but what we did before that, where we had 2 solutions. So just to kind of recap from that, sine x equals root 3 over 2, negative root 3 over 2. So when we were going to solve this a couple units ago, we first looked at what angles, when I take the sine of them, will give me a negative value. Well, according to this, sine is positive in these two, so it can't be either one of those. So it's going to be the 2 angles in these 2 quadrants, 3 and 4. So then I want to think about which reference angle, will give me a sine value of negative root 3 over 2. So on the outside, I'm going to look for where do I see a negative root 3 over 2 in the y value of my angle. So when we look at that, that's going to give us 240 degrees for this quadrant and 300 degrees for quadrant 4, and these would be your 2 solutions. So it's going back to how we did them a ways back with our solving. So let's do another one just to kind of remember from way back when. It's been a little while. Cosine of 1/2. So again, we're positive, so I want to look where are cosines positive. They're negative here and here, so that means my angles have to come from quadrants 1 and 4. So now I'm going to think, where do I see in the x spot a 1/2 for my cosine on my unit circle? And so when we look at those 2 angles, we see that we're going to get 60 degrees and 300 degrees. And those would be your 2 answers between 0 and 360. Okay, so hopefully that kind of recaps your memory from a couple units ago when we were first doing this to solve for different angles. So we're using that same idea from a couple units ago. Now, here's an example of how they're going to change slightly, and it's not in this part, it's in solving for the trig function. So what we are going to run into is something like root 2 times sine x plus 1 equals 0. So before we can even get to this part where we're looking at quadrants, we have to get the trig function by itself. So I'm going to start by subtracting 1 from both sides. So I'll get equals negative 1. And then I need to divide both sides by root 2. And this is where it would be helpful to rationalize just so that it matches our unit circle. So we're going to have negative root 2 over 2. So now now that my trig function's by itself, I know my sine is negative in the bottom 2 quadrants. So I can look to see what angles give me a sine value of negative root 2 over 2. And that would be 225 and 315. So again, these are just values that are these angles are all coming from the unit circle and how we're reading from the outside of the unit circle to the angle that gives us that value. Okay, I want to do one more here with you tonight, and then we'll do 3 more that are going to be where we get the type where we end up with more than 2 solutions. We'll talk about those when we get into class. But for right now, let's do one more here where we have to solve for the trig function before we can do our quadrants. So cotangent x plus 1 equals 0. So I'm going to subtract the 1 to both sides and then consider my quadrants. So even though this is a cotangent, it's going to follow the same quadrants as its inverse tangent. So a tangent's going to be negative in quadrants 2 and in quadrant 4. So now I want to think about if I flip this to be 1 over tangent and then flip this side, I still get negative 1. So where does tangent equal negative 1? So on our unit circle, we can look for where tangent is negative 1, and we notice that that's at 135 and 315. So remember, this is where you're looking for the tangent of x equals negative 1, and then you would just do the reciprocal, which is negative 1. So the same angles would work, 135 and 315 for that one. So like I said, tomorrow in class, or sorry, Monday in class, we're going to look at 3 more. And these 3, just to kind of show you how they're a little different, we're going to do one that looks like 3 times tangent squared x minus 1 equals 0. So when we look at this one, I want you to notice this is what we're going to do when we have a squared. Things change slightly. Or they don't change, but there's a little extra step in how you solve it. Because again, we have to get the tangent by x by itself, and so we have to unsquare it, which opens up the doors to a couple things. So the ones that don't have a squared, you can just solve for the trig function and then go to your quadrants. We're going to look at this type together in class, and this type tend to give us more than 2 solutions sometimes, as well as no solutions sometimes. So we're going to look at 3 of these in class on Monday.